One of the consistent comments that I've heard from my last few Predecessor videos is that I cheerlead for Predecessor too much, where I don't really talk about the negatives a ton, and there's some truth to that. So this video started out life as like a 3 things I'm scared about for Predecessor kind of video, or more clickbaity, like 3 things that could kill Pred before it ever starts. But as I wrote up the scripts for those videos, they didn't really feel worth making. They didn't add anything to a conversation, so I went a different direction with it. This still addresses some of my biggest concerns, but in a way that I feel is more profitable. So, here's a few things that Predecessor needs to get right to pop off in early access. Hey there, internet strangers. It's Truth in here. Let's dive right into this. Point number 1. Let's start obvious. Functionality. Predecessor has got to be a stable, mostly bug-free experience that people are able to actually log in and play. Now, if that sounds painfully obvious, it is. If we look back at Predecessor's last stress test weekend, obviously that did not go the way that we wanted it to, or the company who just got their startup money and is trying to make their game in a super competitive niche take off would want either. But don't think that this is just a problem with Omeda. As a longtime fan of the Battlefield series, I've lived through multiple crap launches of multi-million-dollar titles. This stuff just isn't super easy. I am going to keep this part short as it is obvious, but the few things that I really want Predecessor to look out for is ping. It's got to feel like you're playing in your region and not have some Russian hacker mans teleporting around in your lobbies in NA. The backend's got to be able to handle whatever number of players end up being thrown at it, especially if this is pay to play or anything like that for early access, which we're going to talk about shortly. And lastly, I would love to just say, no crashes or whatever. Obviously, fewer crashes would be better. But when there are crashes, as it's an early access game and there just will be, that there are immediate solutions to them. So like if somebody crashes out of the draft, matches don't start 4v5. If somebody gets bugged out in game, instead of just like not being able to back and being stuck on terrain, they can back and reset. Or if you disconnect from a match, you can reconnect. I think many of these features are already in place, but those are going to be hugely important because that's just kind of the curse of a 5v5 team-based game. If the game is ruined for one person, it's likely ruined for the other 9 in the lobby as well. Let's move on to point number 2, and this one's probably just as obvious, the feel. When people played Paragon, it just made them feel some type of way. Like there's not a better explanation than that. There's nothing more scientific or measurable. The game feel is what made Paragon Paragon. I know that there were a lot of non-mobile people, me being one of them at the beginning, that stuck with Paragon for almost the feel alone. And then on the other side of that coin, I know that there were MOBA veterans who swapped to Paragon from not really even arguably better designed, more polished, more complete MOBAs, and then stuck with Paragon because of the feel. And then if we get real about everybody that tunes into this video, 5 years after the dream of Paragon was launched and 3 years after it died, we just want to have that feeling. And we're holding on to hope that this game can capture that experience. All that said, my big hot take for this video, Predecessor does not need to feel just close to as good as Paragon felt. And realistically, it doesn't need to just feel the same as Paragon played and felt, as good as that was. Realistically, it needs to be better. Paragon's retention stats sucked, and I know that the other systems in the game had a lot to do with it, but if they can't nail the feeling, then that's the first thing that's going to turn people off of the game. Even from really early on in development, like this footage here. I can honestly say that every game of Predecessor that I've gotten the privilege to play has felt great, but this has to hold up past the first few games and the nostalgia goggles effect. I normally stay away from this kind of stuff, and I've been very intentional about that because I don't play Fault, have not played Overprime yet, and I don't really like comparing them. But if it was enough to just have Paragon's heroes and a map that looks decent and gameplay systems around it that are relatively competitive and functional, Fault would have a healthy player base right now. Omeda really does need to nail the feeling. 2 areas/examples that I think will be pretty telling in this regard. First, I'm going to call it the Jank effect. Like obviously you want your camera of your character to behave a certain way, be predictable. You want a couple of different examples I could throw into this, but the one that I want to focus on, I'm going to call gameplay ability interactions. The best way that I can think about this is when two heroes are about to fight and they have their specific abilities and they hit buttons in a certain order, what happens? If one character casts one ability while another character is casting this ability, how do those two abilities interact? And the example that comes to my mind would be like Murdoch's Buckshot and its knockback against different characters who have charge abilities like Grux or Steel. 10 out of 10 times, the same thing needs to happen. Over time, we may realize, it kind of feels bad if Murdoch's Buckshot knocks Steel backwards during his charge. I don't know how they actually interact currently. But 10 out of 10 times, the same thing needs to happen. Because if they don't behave predictably in a 1v1 fight, imagine the chaos in 5v5s in a game that has to have combat readability. The desired outcome of that interaction can change over time if they want that interaction to work differently. But if those interactions only work 4 out of 10 times as opposed to 10 out of 10, they would have to fix it before they could change it. That's what I call jank. It's got to be predictable. Another area of jank that I would love for Predecessor to watch out for is in like systematic game design decisions. And the example that I'll use for that would be like the interaction between CCing an ultimate that's channeled, like Gideon's or Narbash's or Aurora's, even though we don't have Aurora yet to my knowledge. They need to be standardized. It feels really bad if you stun a Gideon out of his ult on the first like tick of the animation, but then he just gets to recast it. Meanwhile, as a Narbash, if you get stunned out of your ult on the first tick of Crash Bang Boom, it goes on a full cooldown. As opposed to Aurora, who at the beginning, if she got stunned out at the beginning of her ult, it went on like a soft 30-second cooldown before they changed that. I'm sure that there's a right answer among those three options. I'm not going to pretend to know what it is, but I would argue that those need to be standardized, and those are just some of the examples. The last thing you want to do is make your players feel like they're being punished for doing what should be the right thing. When I say jank and game design decisions, that's what I'm talking about. There's more examples that could be put here, just like there are more examples that could be put in kind of the feel part of that, the way the screen shake works, the way that ability effects take up your screen. But point being, Omeda just needs to do their best to minimize the jank. You guys can let me know down in the comments which things that you're worried about. Moving on to the last and potentially most controversial and practical point of this video, monetization. This is something that they have to get right, but we have next to no public information as to what their plans are. If you want to talk about one thing that can kill a game before it gets off the ground, even from huge studios, it's terrible monetization, and Paragon definitely suffered. As I move forward in this conversation, I want to keep two specific things in mind. One, that I'm referring to early access. I'm sure that as the game reaches full release and monetization becomes a more centralized part of the game, that there will be other solutions. And two, that Omeda went out and did things the quote real gaming company type of way. They didn't crowdfund. They went out and secured private backing from private companies who they apparently demonstrated the ability that they could make monetizable content to. That means that there's two bills that are coming due. One, from us players, they have to prove to us that the game is worth our time or our money. And two, an actual bill from investors. I'm going to focus on what I call the first bill, our response as players, but you cannot ignore the fact that Predecessor will not be afforded the same excuses that crowdfunded games are often. Add on top of that the added layer of complexity that this game is using assets made by another company. There will be people, me honestly being one of them, that will be slightly weary of paying for things made from assets by another company. Predecessor is going to be navigating a minefield that they're going to have to be super careful in and isn't super precedented. There aren't a ton of projects, at least none that reach great commercial success like Predecessor. That said, I do see a ton of comments regarding Predecessor, like my wallet is ready, I'm throwing money at my screen, why isn't the game out yet? All those types of things. The sentiment is there from this player base. We want to support this project. But the question is how? The obvious and best case solution, in my opinion, is that Omeda just goes full out with their talent when it comes to artists and modelers, and they have original cosmetics that are fairly priced. If they go that route and everything that we can get is skin based and it is non-gameplay affecting, best case scenario. That's a ton to ask for an early access game, and it's also odd for there to be a ton of, cosmetic items in early access when you're focusing on getting the gameplay perfected. But that's the option that in the long run seems the most palatable to me. Next up in the obvious category, I think we have Founders Packs. Some sort of pay-to-play for at least the start of early access makes a lot of sense. I know that it would technically be paying for heroes that were made by another company, but it's more just to be able to get into the game. And then the third option that I've seen tossed around a ton would be paying for heroes in-game with in-game currency or premium currency to unlock them. I know for me, I don't want the game to be super aggressively monetized. You guys can let me know down in comments what you would be comfortable with seeing in the shop, in the game in early access. As we move closer and into full release, obviously the monetization will become a bigger and bigger part of the story, because this game does have to turn a profit, and maybe then they go crazy with seasonal passes or battle passes, or they may go real crazy with things like heirlooms and other games having their kind of signature monetization models. Maybe Predecessor comes up with something crazy and cool like that as well. But to wrap up this part on the early access launch and monetization, I don't want it to become a negative factor. I don't want it to be mentioned in reviews. I don't want it to be one of those things where somebody said, oh, I'd really like to try that Predecessor game, but XYZ about monetization. I know that they have to have it. I know that it's going to be a part of the game, but I don't want it to be a distraction from what Predecessor is and could be. But that's enough out of me. I want to know what you guys think. Tell me what your biggest worries are for Predecessor, especially for early access. I know that we all are probably hoping that this game does well. I hope that this format of video was still good. I know that I didn't just go on the warpath and talk about all the things that I don't like or whatever, but I did address several of those fears, and in a way that still felt like a video worth making, which is important to me. I appreciate all the love and positivity around the channel recently. You guys are literally the best, and I will catch you internet strangers in the next one.